Whispers from the Wilderness, a story that defies explanation. She emerged from the treeline like a ghost, a specter draped in rags and smeared with something dark. Crimson against the unrelenting gray-green of the taiga. Silence clung to her, a heavier shroud than the tattered remnants of her clothes. Days later, rescued but not saved, the young woman, let's call her Katia, remained locked within herself, her eyes reflecting horrors words could not touch. What nightmare had unfolded deep within the remote, unforgiving maze of peaks known colloquially as the Serpent's Spine? What unspeakable event had claimed the lives of her 6 companions, leaving her the sole survivor of a hiking tragedy that defied all logical explanation? This isn't just a recounting of facts, the official reports are thin, unsatisfying things, whispering of hypothermia and misfortune while screamingless silent on the visceral terror Katia's 1,000-yard stare conveyed. No, this is an attempt to peer into that abyss, to weave a narrative from the chilling fragments of an unexplained mystery. It's a story born from whispers on the Siberian wind, a creative exploration grounded in the stark reality of 7 people entering the wilderness and only one stumbling out, forever changed. We delve into a survival story where survival itself feels like a curse, a mountain horror etched not just in the landscape, but in a survivor's soul. The Serpent's Spine, even the name sounds like a warning. A remote wilderness that guards its secrets fiercely. The expedition was meant to be challenging, yes, but not this. Not a plunge into collective madness ending in grotesque, inexplicable death. Why did healthy, experienced hikers suddenly turn on themselves, or fall victim to something so swift and violent it left no clear trace, only shattered bodies and shattered minds? The questions multiply, refusing easy answers. They echo eerily, disturbingly, across the decades, resonating with the lingering enigma of another doomed journey, another group lost to the unforgiving Russian wild under circumstances just as bizarre, just as horrifying, the infamous Mountain of 9 incident. Is there a connection? A shared darkness that haunts these desolate places? We cannot know for certain. But we can follow the path, trace the steps that led Katia and her companions up into the embrace of the Serpent's Spine. We can imagine the biting wind, the camaraderie turning to fear, the moment when the ordinary frayed and the nightmare began. This is their story, or perhaps, one version of it, pieced together from the silence and the screams. It starts, as these things often do, with ambition, trust, and a leader whose reputation was as formidable and debated as the peaks she sought to conquer. But who were these ill-fated adventurers, and what truly drove their enigmatic guide, a woman known for pushing boundaries, to lead them into the heart of a storm that would consume almost all of them? At the heart of this doomed expedition pulsed the formidable will of Anastasia Belova. 41 years old, a veteran hiking instructor whose name echoed through the Siberian wilderness community with a mixture of awe and sharp criticism. To her colleagues, often men who perhaps felt challenged by her expertise and uncompromising methods, she was too much. Too survivalist. Too aggressive. Dangerously reckless, they muttered, pushing her young charges into situations that courted disaster. They whispered she treated the unforgiving taiga like a personal proving ground, always needing to conquer, to dominate, perhaps compensating for slights felt elsewhere in her life. Would her relentless drive eventually get someone killed? The question hung heavy in the smoky rooms where expedition plans were debated. But ask her students. You'd hear a different story entirely. On the trail, she was Anastasia the Fearless, seemingly woven from the same ancient fabric as the mountains themselves. Tuned into nature's rhythms, reading the wind and the tracks like an open book. They felt utterly safe under her watch, shielded by her competence. Then, back at camp, another Anastasia emerged, nurturing, almost motherly, tending to blisters and bruised egos with unexpected tenderness. This duality fascinated them, bound them to her. Former students spoke of a mentorship that transcended mere hiking skills. She taught a mindset, an unyielding resilience they carried into their adult lives, crediting her iron will for their own successes. Complex. Contradictory. A force of nature herself. Was her deep, almost spiritual connection to the wilderness a gift, or a dangerous obsession bordering on recklessness? Perhaps even she didn't truly know. For the trek up the Serpent's Spine that summer of 1993, Anastasia had handpicked her expedition team. 6 students, ranging in age but united by a reasonable level of experience and, more importantly, by their faith in her leadership. There was Dmitri, 23, strong, capable, the most physically competent of the group. Not her biological son, but hers in every way that mattered. She'd raised him since boyhood, a bond forged in shared hardship perhaps, unspoken but fiercely protective. He moved with the quiet confidence of her chosen lieutenant, more assistant than pupil on this journey. Then came Elena, the eldest at 24, maybe a touch world-weary but sharp and observant. 19-year-old Sergei, quiet but known for his endurance. 16-year-old Olga, carrying a sketchbook, finding beauty even in the harshest landscapes. 15-year-old Mikhail, the youngest, brimming with wide-eyed enthusiasm that sometimes masked inexperience. And finally, 17-year-old Katya, the quiet one, the watcher, through whose eyes this nightmare would eventually be pieced together. The plan itself seemed straightforward, almost deceptively beautiful on the maps spread across Anastasia's worn table. They'd journey from the outpost town near the vast, crystalline expanse of Deepwater Lake, the deepest lake in Russia, pushing north and inland. The initial stretch promised stark beauty, rolling, barren terrain of rock and resilient grasses above the tree-line, before the final ascent to the target, the Serpent's Spine Ridge itself. 50 miles, roughly. Manageable. At the ridge, shelter awaited, firewood, a planned respite before the descent. Other groups were on similar paths, including one led by Anastasia's own biological daughter, with whom they'd planned a rendezvous in the forests lower down. An air of anticipation settled over the group as they made final preparations. Friendships, budding romances, quiet rivalries, the usual dynamics of youth thrown together in pursuit of adventure, all simmering beneath the surface. They trusted Anastasia. They trusted the plan. They trusted the clear summer skies forecasted for their journey across this ancient slice of Siberia. With spirits high and the sun warming their faces, they stepped onto the trail, unaware that the mountain held more than just physical challenges, it held a descent into madness. That illusion of sun-warmed promise shattered with brutal speed. As Anastasia Belova's expedition team climbed higher, leaving the last stunted trees behind them, the Serpent's Spine decided to show its teeth. The shift wasn't gradual, it was a violent slamming shut of a door. One moment, blue sky and deceptive warmth, the next, the temperature plummeted as if the sun had been extinguished. Gray clouds boiled over the ridges, thick and menacing, spitting rain that turned instantly to stinging sleet, then choking, blinding snow. It came horizontally, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee, tearing at their clothes, finding every gap, chilling them to the bone. They were utterly exposed. Vulnerable. Tiny figures against a vast, indifferent canvas of rock and raging storm. The first day was miserable. The second, pure Sisyphusine torture. Each step forward felt like 10 steps back. The wind never ceased its assault, a physical pressure trying to peel them off the mountainside. Morale, initially buoyed by Anastasia's fierce optimism, began to fray, then unravel completely. Laughter died first, replaced by grim silence, then by muffled sobs lost in the gale. Mikhail, the youngest, stumbled frequently, his initial eagerness drowned in exhaustion and fear. Olga's sketchbook remained tucked away, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with artistic inspiration. Even Sergei's quiet endurance seemed to crack under the constant barrage. Katya watched it all, the growing despair, the way Elena's gaze kept flicking towards the invisible summit, perhaps calculating odds, perhaps just praying. Physical exhaustion was a constant companion, a leaden weight in their limbs, but the gnawing fear, the isolation, that was worse. The endless, howling white void pressed in, threatening to swallow them whole. And Anastasia? She remained the eye of the storm. Her iron will seem forged anew in the mountain's fury. Keep moving. She'd bark, her voice barely audible over the wind. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. Attitude is everything. Do not be victims. Her legendary stoicism was absolute, almost terrifyingly so. Did she not feel the cold? Did the despair not touch her? Or was it an act, a mask held in place by sheer, desperate determination? Her relentless push, once inspiring, now felt different. Harsh. Unyielding. As if the mountain's cruelty had seeped into her. Did she see the breaking point in her student's eyes? If she did, she gave no sign, relentlessly leading the charge towards the Hamar-Daban ridge. By the evening of the third brutal day, August 4th, they were agonizingly close. Perhaps 30 minutes, a mere kilometer, from the summit shelter, a known refuge with firewood, protection. Yet, it was here, on this completely exposed, wind-lashed saddle, devoid of any natural cover, that Anastasia stopped. Abruptly. She turned, her face nearly invisible behind ice-caked hood and goggles, and announced, "We camp here. For the night." A collective stunned silence, broken only by the wind's howl. Here? Why here? The forest, offering at least some protection, was miles back down the slope, but the summit shelter, it was right there. Did she not know? Was her map useless in the whiteout? Or did she look at her charges, shivering, soaked, swaying on their feet, and make a terrible calculation? That they simply couldn't make it? Perhaps Dmitri, ever loyal but practical, started to protest, his words snatched away by the wind. Maybe Elena shot her a look of disbelief. We don't know. The decision remains a baffling, controversial point in the unfolding tragedy. A fatal error? A necessary evil? Whatever the reason, the command was given. This exposed, God-forsaken patch of rock would be their sanctuary. The night was hell-rendered in ice and wind. Setting up the two flimsy tents was a battle against the gale. Wet, frozen fabric fought them, guy ropes whipping like angry snakes. Inside, crammed together for warmth that never came, they huddled in damp, clammy sleeping bags that felt colder than the air outside. The tiny kerosene stoves sputtered, offering scant heat and greasy fumes. Sleep was impossible. The wind hammered the tents relentlessly. Around 2 a.m., ropes snapped, figures stumbled out into the blinding fury to resecure them. Later, closer to 4, the wind found a new purchase, lifting the windward side of one tent, tearing stakes from the frozen ground. Icy water rushed in, soaking everything, everyone. They fixed it again, numb fingers fumbling, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Hypothermia was no longer a risk, it was a certainty settling into their bones. Utterly miserable, dangerously cold, trapped in a flimsy shelter on an exposed mountainside, the sense of impending doom was palpable, a silent scream beneath the storm's roar. As the frozen dawn broke, revealing a world encased in ice, Anastasia knew their situation had become critical. Survival now depended on reaching the relative safety of the trees below, a desperate gamble that would unleash the mountain's true horror. That desperate gamble, born of freezing desperation after a hellish night, began the moment Anastasia Belova roused her exhausted students. Down, she'd commanded, her voice tight, strained against the lingering wind, pointing towards the barely visible tree-line miles below. Down to the forest. We make fire. Now. Stiff, numb fingers fumbled with frozen tent canvas and stiffened backpacks. Hope was a frozen cinder, but the instinct to obey Anastasia, ingrained over days of hardship, propelled them into a ragged line. They started down the icy slope, a slow, agonizing shuffle. They hadn't covered 10 meters when it began. It started with Dmitri. Anastasia's rock, her fiercely loved surrogate son, the strongest among them. He stumbled, not like someone merely tired, but as if tripped by an unseen hand. Sergei and Katya helped him up, his face confused, shaken. He took 2 more faltering steps, then collapsed again, harder this time. As Katya reached for him, she saw his eyes. Wide. Impossibly wide, filled with a primal terror that had no visible source. Then it happened. Thick, dark blood began to stream. From his nose. From his ears. From his mouth, bubbling slightly. A choked gasp, and he went utterly still. Anastasia screamed, a raw, animal sound torn from her throat, shattering the icy air. She scrambled to him, shaking him, searching frantically for a pulse, her iron composure completely disintegrated. "No! Dmitri! No!" Her anguish was a physical blow to the others, who stood frozen, paralyzed by the sudden, inexplicable violence. How? Why? He'd been fine moments before. Panic began to ripple through the small group, a silent wave of disbelief and mounting dread. Anastasia, kneeling in the snow, clutching Dmitri, seemed rooted to the spot. "Go," she choked out, waving them away, her voice thick with grief. "Go, Forrest." But they hesitated, pleading silently, unwilling to leave her. Only moments later, she cried out again, a different sound this time, pain, sharp and sudden. "Can't move." Katya, turning back towards her leader, saw it happening again. Blood seeped from Anastasia's nose, her ears. Her breath came in ragged, heaving gasps. She clawed weakly at her throat, her eyes mirroring Dmitri's terror, before she pitched forward, collapsing onto his still form. Dead. Now, true panic erupted. Mass hysteria seized the remaining students. Katya, stumbling backwards, trying to process the double horror, felt a terrifying sense of wrongness, of contagion. She frantically checked her own face, her ears, finding nothing. But turning, she saw the nightmare spreading. Elena, the eldest, was screaming, tearing at her own jacket with insensible fury. Olga, the sensitive artist, began clawing at her throat, her face contorted, foam flecking her lips. She staggered, then fell, rolling, writhing in the snow like an animal in a trap. Katya reached for her, a reflexive gesture of help, and Olga bit her hand, hard, before curling into a tight ball and going still. Simultaneously, Elena, still screaming incoherently, stumbled towards a jagged outcrop of rock and began, deliberately, horribly, bashing her head against it. Again. And again. The sickening thud echoed in the wind until she too slumped, lifeless. Pure, adrenaline-fueled survival instinct took over Katya. 4 down. 2 left besides herself. Mikhail, the youngest, simply crumpled where he stood, falling face-first into the snow without a sound. Katya didn't even check, she knew. Her eyes darted towards Sergei, the quiet one. He was crouched behind a low rock, partially shielded from the wind, but blood streamed freely from his nose and mouth. Yet, his eyes met hers, and for a terrifying, lucid moment, he spoke, his voice raspy, urgent. "Katya, bag, essentials. Run. Forrest. I'll." His voice trailed off, his eyes clouding over. "Run." The command cut through her terror. She scrambled to her own backpack, numb fingers grabbing her sleeping bag, a few small vital items. She risked one last glance back at Sergei. He was slumped over his pack now, head down, blood pooling beneath him. Almost certainly gone too. Alone. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone amidst this inexplicable carnage, this mountain madness. Whatever had killed them, it could still be here. It could be coming for her. Blind with terror, Katya scrambled down the slope, the horrifying tableau burning behind her eyes. She plunged into the trees, seeking refuge but finding only a deeper, more terrifying isolation. Was she truly alone, or was the mountain's madness chasing her still? Echoes in the silence, survival and discovery. Alone and hunted by her memories, Katya plunged deeper into the relative shelter of the trees. Relative. The forest offered little comfort, only a different kind of terror. She found a shallow overhang beneath a cluster of ancient rocks, crawled inside her sodden sleeping bag, and drifted in and out of a state that wasn't quite consciousness, wasn't quite sleep, but a horrifying limbo filled with flashing images, Dmitri's wide, terrified eyes, Anastasia's raw scream, Elena's head hitting the rock, again and again. Survival became purely instinctual. She chewed on tough leaves, lit condensation from stones, her body fueled by a terror so profound it eclipsed hunger and cold. For 4 days, she existed in this state, expecting death at every rustle of leaves, every shadow that moved. Was it an animal? A bear? Or was it, The inexplicable force that had torn through her friends, still out there, hunting her. The storm, which had briefly abated, returned with fury that first night alone, the sound of massive trees crashing down around her in the darkness a constant, terrifying percussion against her fragile hiding place. If the mountain madness didn't take her, a fallen giant surely would. She lost track of time. Day bled into night, bled into gray, frozen dawn. How long had it been? 3 days? 4? She was weak, disoriented, the trauma having scoured her mind raw. Then, faintly, through the sighing wind, voices. Male voices, rough, unfamiliar. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her fog of terror. Or was it another trick of the mountain? Hesitantly, driven by the last dregs of self-preservation, she stumbled towards the sound, pushing through tangled undergrowth until she reached the bank of a wide, slate-gray river. There, poling a long, shallow boat through the current, were 2 men, local Evenki hunters by their look, weathered faces scanning the shores. They saw her. And stopped dead. Katia just stood there, swaying slightly, a wild apparition at the forest's edge. Ragged clothes barely clinging to her thin frame, face gaunt, eyes vacant and huge. Dried blood, Olga's. Her own. Theirs. Smeared across her cheek and jacket. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stared. The hunters exchanged a wary glance. Fear? Superstition? Who could blame them? But after a long moment, compassion won out. They carefully brought the boat ashore, calling out softly. Hey! Are you all right? Little sister? No response. She just stood there, trapped behind walls of shock. Gently, they approached, wrapped her in thick furs from their boat, lifted her aboard as if she were a broken doll, and pulled back towards the small settlement downstream. Rescue. But the ordeal was far from over. Back in the relative safety of the town, the questions began. Politely at first, then more urgently. Who are you? Where are the others? What happened? Katia remained mute, locked away. Days passed. Finally, in fragments, punctuated by shudders and long silences, the witness account emerged. A story so horrifying, so bizarre, it strained credulity. Sudden collapses. Bleeding. Madness. Violent deaths. Officials listened, perhaps skeptical, but the girl's raw terror was undeniable. A search was launched, hampered by the vastness of the wilderness and the lingering bad weather. It took them a month. A whole month. When they finally reached the exposed saddle high on the serpent's spine where Katia said it happened, the scene confirmed the horror, if not the explanation. 6 bodies, frozen solid, scattered across the rocky ground. Contorted into unnatural shapes, faces locked in grotesque masks of absolute terror and agony. Most were missing significant clothing, shoes inexplicably discarded. And the final, chilling detail that stumped everyone, all 6 were missing their eyeballs. Plucked clean. How? Autopsies followed, of course. The conclusions felt clinical. Inadequate. Hypothermia, yes, a contributing factor, no doubt. A strange protein deficiency was noted, despite evidence they'd been eating adequately. Bruised lungs across the board, from what? Falling? The pressure? Nobody knew. But these sterile findings offered nothing to explain the sudden, violent eruption Katia had described. Nothing about the spontaneous bleeding from eyes, ears, mouths. Nothing about the frenzy, the self-destruction, the inexplicable symptoms. And absolutely nothing about the missing eyes. The discrepancy was enormous, a gaping wound in the official narrative. Hypothermia and malnutrition, the official report read like a tragic but ordinary wilderness accident. Yet, it couldn't explain the bleeding, the madness, the missing eyes, or the chilling echoes of another, equally disturbing incident decades earlier on a different cursed mountain. The Devil's Pass, an older, darker mystery. This wasn't the first time such inexplicable horror had stalked the vast, lonely wildernesses of Russia. The chilling inadequacy of the official findings for Anastasia Belova's doomed group, the sheer baffling violence of their end, finds a disturbing echo decades earlier, in a mystery that remains one of the world's most enduring enigmas. To truly grasp the unsettling questions left hanging over the serpent's spine, we must cast our gaze back to 1959, to the snow-swept slopes of the Ural Mountains, and the infamous incident now often whispered about as the Devil's Pass or the Mountain of Nine. 9 experienced hikers, students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, skilled skiers, tough individuals led by Igor Dyatlov. They were attempting a difficult winter expedition. Much like Anastasia's group, they found themselves caught by rapidly deteriorating weather high on an exposed mountainside, Kholat Syakhl, infamously meaning dead mountain in the local Mansi language. Facing brutal sub-zero temperatures and relentless snowfall, they made a critical, and in hindsight, baffling decision. Instead of retreating down to the treeline for shelter, they chose to make camp right there, on the open, wind-blasted slope. Perhaps overconfidence in their abilities? Or was there another reason they felt compelled to stay put, exposed to the full fury of the elements? We'll never know. What investigators found weeks later beggars belief. Their tent, paradoxically, had been slashed and cut open from the inside. 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent, down the slope towards the forest edge, some barefoot, some only in socks, some wearing a single boot. Ludicrously underdressed for the lethal cold. Incredibly, the initial tracks suggested they walked calmly, not ran, away from their only shelter. Why? What drove them out? The discoveries grew progressively stranger, more horrifying. 2 bodies were found first, beneath a large cedar tree just inside the forest line. They were barefoot and dressed only in their underwear. Nearby were the remains of a small, utterly inadequate fire. The branches high up on the cedar were broken, suggesting the pair had desperately, perhaps frantically, tried to climb it, seeking refuge? Or trying to see something back towards the tent? 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov himself, were found scattered at intervals between the cedar tree and the campsite, positioned as if they had been attempting a desperate return journey before succumbing to the cold. But the final discovery, made months later when the snow thawed, plunged the case into the realm of high strangeness. The remaining 4 hikers were found buried under several feet of snow in a den they had apparently dug near a ravine, deeper into the woods. And their injuries were shocking. 3 had suffered massive internal trauma, injuries likened to those sustained in a major car crash. Crushed ribs, fractured skulls. Yet, crucially, they had minimal external wounds. How is that possible? One woman, Ludmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue, parts of her mouth tissue, and her eyes. Another man, Semyon Zolotaryov, also had his eyes missing. Remember Katya's testimony about the missing eyes on the serpent's spine? The parallel is ice cold. Furthermore, some of these 4 were found wearing pieces of clothing apparently scavenged from their already deceased companions further up the slope. And perhaps strangest of all? Forensic tests detected significant traces of radioactive contamination on some of the victims' clothing. Radiation? Where did that come from? The official Soviet investigation concluded with startling, almost provocative vagueness. The cause of death? Attributed to an unknown compelling force. A phrase dripping with ambiguity, solving nothing, fueling decades of speculation, military weapons testing, infrasound-induced panic, cryptid encounters, UFOs, espionage, the list goes on. Recently, in 2020, a renewed Russian investigation pointed towards a rare type of slab avalanche as the culprit. Yet, this explanation remains highly contested. Critics point to the lack of typical avalanche debris, the hikers' seemingly calm initial departure from the tent, the bizarre injuries inconsistent with snow burial, the missing eyes, the radiation, and the simple fact that the area has no known history of avalanches, ever. So, we look back from the Mountain of Nine to the Serpent's Spine. 2 tragedies, 34 years apart. Both involving experienced groups in remote locations. Both caught by severe weather, making questionable decisions to camp in exposed areas. both ending in bizarre, violent deaths with inexplicable elements, panic, erratic behavior, partial undressing, strange injuries, the chilling detail of missing eyes. Both leaving behind inadequate official explanations that fail to satisfy the disturbing evidence. Coincidence? A pattern deliberately obscured? Or does some unknown horror stalk the remote peaks of the Russian wilderness, claiming victims in ways we cannot comprehend? So, what connects these two horrific events, these screams swallowed by the vast indifference of the Russian wilderness? The parallels between the tragedy on the Serpent's Spine, or Hamar-Daban, as it's known on the maps, and the older, darker mystery of the Devil's Pass, the Dyatlov incident, are too compelling, too specific to simply dismiss as grim coincidence. Two groups of capable, experienced people, caught in the teeth of brutal, unexpected weather. Two baffling decisions to camp exposed, vulnerable, high on unforgiving slopes. Two descents into chaos ending in bizarre, violent deaths. Erratic behavior, clothes inexplicably torn off, panicked flight that defies logic. And the horrifying physical signatures left behind, the inexplicable bleeding from orifices on Hamar-Daban, the devastating internal injuries without external cause at Dyatlov Pass, and in both cases, the chilling detail of missing eyes. It sends a shiver down the spine. Over the years, speculation has run wild, attempting to bridge the chasm between the known facts and the terrifying reality. Could extreme hypothermia alone explain such events? Perhaps it accounts for paradoxical undressing, confusion. But the synchronized, sudden onset of bleeding? The self-destructive violence Katya witnessed? The crushing internal injuries suffered by the Dyatlov group? Hypothermia feels incomplete, insufficient. Others propose theories involving infrasound, low-frequency sound waves generated by wind patterns, capable of inducing panic, dread, even physical discomfort. A plausible trigger for fleeing the tent at Dyatlov, maybe? But again, it falls short of explaining the specific, gruesome injuries or the apparent targeted violence on Hamar-Daban. Military involvement, secret weapons tests gone wrong. These theories persistently shadow both cases, fueled by the remote locations and the era's Cold War paranoia for Dyatlov and lingering secrecy. Cover-ups are certainly not unheard of. Yet concrete evidence remains elusive, leaving only whispers and suspicion. Unknown natural phenomena? Ball lightning? Strange atmospheric conditions? Perhaps. Even paranormal explanations involving local legends or unknown entities find their way into the discussion, born from the sheer lack of rational answers. But ultimately, none of these theories satisfactorily explains everything. Each leaves troubling questions unanswered, loose ends flapping in the wind. The Hamar-Daban case remains officially closed, attributed primarily to hypothermia, an explanation that feels insultingly inadequate given the survivors' testimony. The Dyatlov Pass incident, despite recent reinvestigation pointing to a contested avalanche theory, still holds its secrets tight, the original verdict of an unknown compelling force echoing with unnerving resonance. We are left haunted by the discrepancy, by the sheer high strangeness that clings to both stories. We are forced to confront the raw, untamable power of nature, but also the terrifying limits of our own understanding. Are there forces, phenomena, elements of reality in these vast, lonely places that operate outside our known rules? What truly transpired on those desolate slopes? What terror looked back from those missing eyes? The enduring questions hang heavy in the silence, unanswered screams carried away on the wind, leaving us to contemplate the chilling possibilities that might still lie hidden in the world's dark, forgotten corners.